This is Cameron Carter with Wellborn Engineering and Surveying. And today we're talking about some of the minimum requirements required for rebuilding after the July 4th floods that affected Kerr County. We know that many people were affected, many structures were damaged, many homes were lost. And so as people begin to pick up the pieces and try to figure out where they are going next in terms of being able to rebuild, we wanted to create this video to help provide a resource for a walkthrough to understand what are the actual requirements to get through the rebuilding process. This particular video is going to be focused mostly on Kerr County, the requirements for Kerr County. Obviously, there's going to be people that live within the city of Ingram or within the city of Kerrville, within those city limits, and they will have processes that may or may not be exactly similar to this one. Some elements will be the same, some elements will be different, so I would suggest that you reach out to them specifically about what would be particular for your case if you find yourself with a damaged structure, flood damage structure within those areas. Most people come to us saying that they need an elevation certificate. That may or may not be the case. And so I want to kind of walk you through this process to see when do you actually need an elevation certificate? What does that actually look like? Why would you need that? One point of understanding is that this video was made on August 8th, 2025. There is always new information coming out. Things might change. So if there are any changes after this date, I will certainly create an update to get us the most recent information for everything that's being presented here. But as of now, everything presented as of right now looks to be valid and should give a good idea of how to proceed forward if you're trying to rebuild. Generally speaking, floodplain development permits are required for development within the flood zone. That means we need to define these two terms here. What is development and what is the flood zone? And we need to talk a little bit about the actual permits that are required for development within the flood zone. I'm going to show a flowchart here, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this right now. We'll come back to this at the end of the video. But right now I want to draw your attention to the left side of the flowchart where it talks about substantial damage determination and flood zone determination. These are really the two main questions that need to be answered in order to proceed forward. Now you'll see if you have a no on either the substantial damage determination or the flood zone determination, it leads to a zone that says no permit required. That may or may not be true depending on how the county actually approaches this. And it may be absolutely 100% true that if you do not have substantial damage, that you are not located in the flood zone, or either of those two are true, that you don't need a permit. However, the county, at the end of the day, is going to have to justify, document, and keep records of everything that all the decisions they've made for every rebuilding that's done within the flood zone or structures that have been damaged. And they may use the tool of the flood permit to actually be able to document and show where permits were not required. And yes, it sounds very ironic, but until further notice, they might, they may not, but I could certainly anticipate that they might use the flood permit process in order to document cases where a flood permit was actually not required. So even though there's no permit required, that does not necessarily mean you may not need to submit a floodplain permit to the county. It should be noted that the county has waived all fees for floodplain permits where there has been flood damage. If you're trying to create a new structure within the floodplain that has nothing to do with structures that were damaged on July 4th, you will have to actually pay the floodplain permit fees to the county. So let's get into this whole concept of what is development. Really, we're going to have four different categories that's going to classify as development. The first one will be repairs made to structures with substantial damage. We'll define this in a second. Substantial improvements made to structures, new construction, changes made to the existing grade of a site. And again, that's going to be changes made in the flood zone, either in the riverbanks or something along those lines. It should be noted that obviously with the flood, the actual topography of the riverbed has changed greatly, and we may or may not have actual records of what it looks like right now. But even if you're changing grades or trying to set things back to the way they were, whatever is on the ground post-flood, that's going to be considered to be the existing grade of the site. So any changes made to that would need a floodplain development permit. and any combination of the above. So if you're trying to build new construction and change grades around it, that would need a floodplain development permit. If you have a structure that was completely washed away and you want to bring in fill to try to elevate the structure, again, that's a change made to the grade of the site. That's going to require a floodplain development permit. So what exactly is substantial damage? From FEMA directly, substantial damage is defined as damage of any origin. So it could be from the flood, it could be from a fire that happened after the flood, it could be the volunteer doesn't really know what they're doing and they knock something over. It can be damage of any origin sustained by a structure whereby the cost of restoring the structure to its before damaged condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. What does that actually mean? Let's say, just for argument's sake, that you have a structure that is worth $100,000. Again, these are not real market values. This is just a value used for easy math. If it's going to take $50,000 or more to bring that structure back up to the state it was prior to the damage that was incurred by the flood or whatever other origin the damage came from, then that is going to be substantial damage. The repair costs are going to exceed 50% of the market value of the structure. Now, how do we actually determine what the market value is? That is a great question. This can be determined through a number of different ways. One, if you have an existing appraisal of the structure, that is the best way to look at it. And it should be very clear. The market value is of the structure, not of the land. Many times you can go to, you can also look at a CAD site, a community assessor district, and they will tell us, tax assessor, and they will tell us exactly what the value is of the property, but they'll also break it out between the land and the structures. It really is the market value of the structure, not the property in whole, that determines what the actual market value is of that structure, not necessarily of the land. So that market value can again be determined through an appraisal. If you have a record of an appraisal, Ingram recent was good. If you have the county tax assessor site can also be consulted to determine market values. If you have something else, you might be able to use it. If FEMA comes out and visits your property or visits the structure, they might have a way to determine what the market value is through their own means and methods. So if you're not happy with what they come up with and you want to find something else, you're going to have to figure out a way to actually get that assessed and determined. So really getting an assessment of the property is probably the best way to do that through an assessor. That kind of sets what the market value is. How do you actually determine what the repair of the cost of repair can be? That can also be done through either FEMA's own means and methods. They can come up with that. Or that can be done through an independent contractor that can look at that number and they can try to provide a bid for how much it'd be to repair. Let's talk about substantial improvements. Substantial improvement is any reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or any other improvement of a structure, the cost of which equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of construction of the improvement. This term includes structures that have incurred substantial damage regardless of actual repair work performed. So this is a case where, let's say you had a home and you wanted to add on an addition outside of the actual footprint of the existing structure. If that addition to the structure, to the building, is going to cost more than 50% of the market value, then that's considered a substantial improvement. And that would mean that you have to work within the regulations of the floodplain development process. You have to make sure the elevations of the building is correct and all this kind of other stuff that go with it. We'll get into those details in just a second. However, if you also have substantial damage to actually improve your structure to the way it was before the damage occurred, that also includes substantial improvement. So anything that's going to create, that's going to cost more than 50% or more than the market value of the home would be substantial improvement. I'm sorry. Sometimes they're referred to as significant improvement, significant damage. It's all the same. It should be noted that there are a few exceptions that go into the substantial improvement costs. So for example, if you have an existing violation of any kind of code, and in the county, we don't have building codes, but let's say there's something that needs to be done for the septic or even something for the wiring or the plumbing that needs to be upgraded just to meet basic codes, those costs for that specific item of improvement in order to meet the codes actually does not count against the value for the substantial improvement. Additionally, if you have a historic structure, and again, this is not just because you think it's a historic structure, it's because it's on a list by the National Register of Historic Places, or there's some sort of federally certified state program has the structure on the list, or there's a local historic preservation board that is federally certified. If they have this building on the list, or they will include it on the list, then it's classified as a historic structure and it will not be considered as substantially improved if you're trying to restore it to what it was before the flood. However, you will now have to abide to all the regulations and all the requirements that that particular historical preservation board or preservation officer requires for that structure. So there's definitely some items to consider in that. So how can you actually determine whether you have substantial damage or not? First of all, I want to say at the end of the day, it really is going to be your floodplain community administrator that makes this determination. They are the ones who will say whether you have significant damage or substantial damage, or you have a substantial improvement or not. Nonetheless, it's always good to be educated so you can try to have an idea of what to expect as we move forward in this process. Some things do indicate that you might have substantial damage. One being that the structure is dislodged from the foundation. If the roof has been removed, if the walls are collapsed, if you can't just get in there, quickly after the flood, and I know we're 2 months after at this point, but if there's things that are going to take a very long time to repair, that might be an indication that there is substantial damage. What might not be substantial damage, generally speaking, rule of thumb, if you have flood levels within the home that are less than 3 feet, then it's likely you have a better chance that you're not looking at a case of substantial damage. When you go above 3 feet, you're beginning to get into the area where it's most likely to be considered substantial damage. No structural damage. And then if all you're talking about for the repair is really just things like the replacement of insulation, drywall, damaged electrical units, anything like that goes in there. Another thing to just be clear on is that any appliances within the home or any other mechanical units are not going to really be considered as part of the value of the home, aside from air conditioning or something that's actually a permanent fixture of the structure. So your fridges, your washing machines, those things are not going to necessarily count as part of the market value or the cost of repair. If you really want to get into more of the details in this, I've included this website down here from FEMA, and they will go into significant detail if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of how these things are defined for substantial damage and for substantial improvement. So you can check that out there. As I mentioned before, really the determination of substantial damage is made by the community floodplain administrator. For Kerr County, that's going to be Charlie Hastings and Bobby Gore over there. I provided their information here. For the city of Kerrville, it's going to be Kyle Burrow. And then for the city of Ingram, it's going to be Stuart Gross. Please reach out to them if you have questions. They should be the ones making these determinations for you. Again, I would suggest that you be prepared so that you can help address these types of questions and you are prepared for whatever response they might give you. If you're unhappy with the results and you know you have something to rely on, then you're in a better position to be able to respond when you do get a response. I can't tell you how long it's going to take to get those responses. That's not my position here, so I just know that they are in the works to make those determinations in the areas that have been damaged and have been received damage and destruction from the flood. All right. Talking about flood zone, we need to determine whether structures are actually located within the flood zone or not. This is the second element that's going to determine whether a floodplain permit is actually required. If the structure is located within the flood zone, then it has the possibility of requiring a floodplain permit. And that possibility includes that it has sustained substantial damage, or if you're trying to make substantial improvements, or if you're trying to create a new structure within the flood zone, or you're trying to regrade in the flood zone, this will trigger the requirement for a floodplain development permit. So the tool that it's used to actually determine whether a structure is located in the flood zone or not is going to be the Flood Insurance Rate Map, or the FERM for short. And it's going to be located within the Special Flood Hazard Area. And this is basically the extent of the 100-year flood as per that map, as per the FERM that defines this area. Sometimes you'll see people refer to the floodplain. Really, the floodplain technical definition is just any land area susceptible to being inundated by flood waters from any source, which is very general, very vague. So I'm going to be referring to flood zone in this case. It has a little more a bit of a technical definition on it. All right, I'm going to walk you through some of the process how you can find your particular address, your particular structure on this map, the flood insurance rate map, the FERM, so you can see for yourself whether you are located within this area or not. So you want to navigate to msc.fema.gov/portal/home. I will include these links in the description so you can go there. And that's going to bring up this page that you see in front of you. Let's look at the post office in Hunt for an example. I'm just going to go ahead and place Hunt, Texas here in the address place. You can put your particular address in here, or city or county, whatever you'd like to put in there. The more specific you are, the better it can be. And then it will bring up this page. This site can be slow at times, so please be aware that it can be very slow in actually loading. If you ever want to download the FERM, you can download it through this. If you want to create your own map, we'll come back to this in a second to show how that works, because this might be something you can provide to the county to indicate that you are either within or outside of the flood zone. All right, let's zoom in here. I'm just going to scroll in to zoom in, and let's take a look at the Hunt post office. You can see the Hunt store here, and right here is the Hunt post office. There are a number of different flood areas on this map that are indicated by these different colored hatches. And let's go through these one by one. First of all, you're going to notice the very far extent, this white line here is the far edge of any inundation area as marked by this area in orange, which is the extent of the 500-year floodplain. And that's going to extend really from this white line all the way across these different colors over to this side. Everything within this area is located within the 500-year floodplain. You're going to notice the Hunt post office is not within not even the 100-year floodplain. Now, again, whether this map is accurate, whether it's detailed, whether it's precise, that's not the question we're trying to determine today. There's a lot we can say about this, and we can discuss those in other videos. But for now, the legally accepted map that is used to determine whether you need a floodplain or not, whether you need flood insurance or not, whether you need all these different items that come into here, is this map right here. Again, we're not saying whether it's good or it's bad or it's precise or not. This is just a legally accepted thing. And today we're talking about minimum requirements. Later on, we'll talk about some better ways we can build to try and avoid tragedy and destruction in the future. But for now, this is really, if you're looking to rebuild, this is the map you need to be looking at. So we have the 500-year in orange. Inside of that, we're going to have this kind of turquoise area from one side to the other. That's going to be zone AE. And you'll see that these little indicators tell you what's going on. You also have a legend down here, scrolling down over this way, that indicate what these different shades of hatching mean. Zone AE means it has a study. If you see AE, it means it has been studied. That means you have water surface elevations across this. So here's an area where they say the water surface elevation of the 100-year flood, as defined by this study, is 1,760 feet. At this cross section, it's 762.2 feet. So if I'm looking at the Hunt post office, and there's a better way to do this, but obviously we can tell that this base flood elevation, known as the BFE, for this post office at the 100 years is going to be somewhere between 1760 and 1762, maybe 1761.8, something, I don't know, somewhere around there. And there's a way we can actually determine that with a much greater degree of certainty, according to this particular model. Within the flood zone, so this area that's turquoise is the flood zone. Areas that are in orange are not the flood zone. The flood zone is, again, according to the 100-year. That's this turquoise area. Within that, we have another area of study that is known as the floodway. This area that has the red hatching is the floodway, and that is a particular area that really is an area that's been dedicated to the flooding of the river. There's a lot of difficulties of trying to build in this area. There's a lot of liabilities building this area. It is highly recommend not to pursue any development within the floodway. Woodburn Engineering and Surveying, we've come to the decision that we're not going to try to pursue any sort of development with this area. So if you approach us and you have a house that's in the floodway, we're just going to have to say no. And I understand that can be very hard and difficult to hear, especially after going through this entire tragedy and the loss of lives, loss of property that everyone has suffered. But really, rebuilding in the floodway is not considered safe. It's not considered a good idea. And this is one of those horrible cases where you have to make a decision for people in the future to provide protection for them so they are not going to face another tragedy like just happened. so people will have a better chance to live because they're not going to be in a spot where they're going to be facing imminent danger. As such, we are not pursuing any kind of help for any clients that are located within the floodway. If you are in this turquoise area, the flood zone, then yes, we can definitely do that. In the floodway, we're not doing that. That does not mean it can't be done. There are other folks out there and they may decide to help you pursue that, but I know for our case that we have decided not to. I have not heard if the county has made a determination or if the city of Ingram or Kerrville has made a determination where they allow development within this area or not. I'd reach out to them directly to figure out what their policies are regarding the floodway. Okay, so this is a studied area, and this is an area where you can make a determination very quickly based on this map here, whether you are in the flood zone or not. Let's say you want to have a little spot here, and you want to say this is your location. And we want to say that this is the area that we're interested in. You can come over here into this dynamic map, and you can hit print, and it will make for you a little mini firm. This is not an official firm by any means, but it is something that is produced by the site that will help you show either to the county or to someone else basically what's going on. Now you see I search for Hunt, and so this little pin here is indicating the center of Hunt. If I actually put the real address of the post office right here, that pin would be there. I would suggest that you put that pin located in the area that you're interested in showing. So that way the floodplain development permit reviewer can see exactly where your structure is, and I'll know, and they can say that, or you can draw it or print this out and put some circles around to indicate where you're looking at. But you can show, hey, this is actually not within the flood zone, and therefore you would be exempt from the floodplain development permit. Okay, going back to here, there are other zones aside from zone AE. I'm going to go over here to the east a little bit, over to this area which is known as zone A. You'll see how the zone A has a white line separating it from zone AE. That means that this area right here is the boundary where this was studied and this area was not studied. You'll notice we have elevations in the zone AE, like the 1748. Here in zone A, there are no elevations. These were lines that were drawn by someone that they believe the flood extent could get to somewhere in this area, but there's never been a study to actually show, number one, if this actually is the flood extent, and number two, what the base flood elevation, water surface elevations would be in these areas. So if you are located in a zone A, you're going to be in a spot where it's going to be a little more difficult to actually determine whether you are located within the flood zone or if you're not. The county and any floodplain administrator can look at a zone A and they can determine if you're in zone A that you're going to have to go through a floodplain development permit. The problem is if you have to go through a floodplain development permit and you need to raise your structure, the question is what elevation are you supposed to raise your structure to? And one tool that is available to answer that question is known as base level engineering, and that is found at a different site. Come up here, and this can be found at webapps.usgs.gov/infrm/ESTBFE, and that's going to be what we got here. When you come to this page, you can then come in and try to get to the region 6, which will include Texas. You have a few different options here. You can go ahead and just plop in your address for your property here. I typically don't recommend that. That might be a good idea to start out with, but sometimes it's not very accurate because you won't be able to see exactly what structure you're talking about if you have multiple structures on your property. I typically just go straight to I want to explore, and then we can come in and we can see the areas that we're interested in. So we're going to go back to Hunt. Let's go back over to our post office and see what we have over here. Now, in this area, this page is going to default to a certain expression of this base level engineering. It should be noted this is a different model than what's shown on the firm. This model is not the legal model. This is a different analysis. It provides some set of data, but it's not the accepted data in Zone AEs. That means that in Zone AE, the firm, that is these maps over here, let me scroll back over to where our post office is at, we'll update. In these areas with Zone AE, this is the official legal model that's being used to determine minimum requirements. However, when you get to Zone A, it can be a little bit different. So let me come over here real quick where it says data. I'm going to click on base level engineering, come down here, turn off flood depth, and I'm going to turn on flood extent 1% and 0.2%. That 1% is going to correspond to your 100-year flood, 0.2% to your 500-year flood. And if I come down over here, you can see here's the post office. It's if I want to show that on imagery, I can click on base map and click on imagery, and now I have the image of this here. And you can see that the post office is actually, according to this model, located within the 100-year flood zone. Again, there are reasons for this. I'm not going to get into that in this video. That's for a different video in the future. But for now, it should be understood that this in Zone E is not the actual legal definition for minimum requirements. Now, you're not bound just to follow the minimum requirements. If this is your case and you suffered severe flood damage like the post office did, and you look at this map and you're like, oof, that looks really bad, and you're in a position where you don't need a floodplain development permit, but you're thinking towards the future, you don't want to have to go through this again, now it's time to look at a different model to see what can we actually do to make the proper steps so that you build a structure that's going to be in a better shape in the future. But that's for a future video. So let's come back over here to our Zone A, over here to the east a little bit. And you'll notice in this area in particular, the Zone A used to come all the way down this road. However, this model is including this area, which is elevated, that is not included within the Zone A. This particular model and this analysis shows that the floodwaters for the 100-year are contained on this side here. Now, if you, for example, had this structure, I don't know who this is. I apologize if this is your structure. I'm just using it because it happens to be a great example. If you're in the structure and you suffered some sort of significant damage and you need to go pursue a floodplain development permit to the county, I would show them both this base level engineering data here, and I would show them from the FEMA the other area. It will be up to them. It is at their discretion as to whether they will still require that you do a floodplain development permit or not. This BLE in Zone A's is considered to be best available data. If you happen to have a flood study for your property, then that might be considered the best available data. So if you have some sort of historic flood study, that's a great resource to have. But for now, I will look at these two sites and provide this information, and that way you can look at this and give them what they need, and they'll make the determination whether yes or no you need to do the floodplain development permit. If they say you still need to do a floodplain development permit, then the question becomes what is the proper elevation to use, and we can figure that out here. For example, if I go over here to this part on the left, it says report, and then I click on map click. I can come over here and I can click somewhat near the structure. I want to click more on the upstream side just to be a little more conservative. And then if I am too far out, I might get off. So sometimes you have to be a little more on the edge of it. It's not liking me today. Let's just kind of click over somewhere in this area. Oh my gosh, my page is not liking this at all. Well, typically, let's try somewhere over here. Well, typically you'd be able to click here and get a report, but apparently the website's having some issues, so I apologize for that. But typically you'd be able to generate a report that would show what the base level engineering has determined to be the flows for the 500-year and the 100-year in this area. Again, I wish I could show that to you. And it's going to be one of those things that just does not work. If you were to go over here to the Zone AE, let's say we want to get this over for the post office, many times it will say, hey, you actually need to go look at the map for the area that's in the study. And you can look at that over there or not. And I would typically not look at that. But again, if you're over in this area, again, let's try it just one more time. Nope, okay, not be able to get it. My apologies. So, but you would get the report and that would be able to tell you what the water surface elevation is in any of these areas that you click on. When the website actually does work, you will get a report that looks a little something like this. And it will show what the actual flood depth is of that particular area that you've clicked on. Ideally, if your structure is covered by the floodplain, you want to click on the most upstream corner of the structure, and that will tell you what the base flood elevation should be in that area. Again, the county's at their discretion. Worst case scenario, they might request a flood study. They might be okay with the BLE. I'm not going to speak for them on that, so that's going to be at their discretion to what they will use for these elevations. So once we have the horizontal location determination made for the flood zone, if you have a structure that's in the flood zone, just because it's located there horizontally does not necessarily mean that it is located within it vertically. And this is actually something where if you need a professional surveyor to come out and determine this, this is something where Wellborn Engineering Surveying can help. There's many other surveyors here in town that can help with this as well. But basically what we would have to do at that point is we'd have to go out to your site and we'd have to take a measurement of the finished floor of the structure to determine whether it is actually below the base flood elevation, at the base flood elevation, or above the base flood elevation. If it is, in fact, above the base flood elevation, then you may not need a floodplain development permit. But the only way to know that is by making the field observation with a certified surveyor, professional surveyor that can determine that elevation of your finished floor. So there's two parts to this. We need to find out where the structure is located relative to the horizontal extents of the flood zone, and we need to see where it is in the actual vertical extents of the flood zone. You might have a house that's has a lot of fill and it's raised up, even though it's horizontally located in the flood zone, it may be well above the base flood elevation. You can even have the opposite case where you'll have structures that are outside of the flood zone, but they're actually located in elevation below the base flood elevation. And that's a whole different deal in those types of cases. So just to go back over this one more time, permits are required for development in the flood zone. Development is going to mean that there's a case of significant damage, there's going to be significant improvement made to take care of the significant damage, or there's going to be additions made or improvements made to the structure itself, new construction, grading, or any other combination. If the answer to any of that is yes, then you have development. Is it located in the flood zone? We check the firm first, and then if you're in a zone A, then you're going to look on the base level engineering site to determine if it's in that zone A, and in conjunction with the firm. If you have a yes to both having development and you're located in the flood zone, then you're definitely going to need a floodplain development permit. All right, you can't go through an engineering presentation without having a flow chart, and here it is. So if we have, let's take the situation where we have determined we have a case for substantial damage, and we are located within the flood zone. This particular flow chart is just for the case of substantial damage. If you're trying to build a new structure, this chart looks very different. If you're trying to grade within the floodplain, this chart looks very different. So just be aware, this is dedicated and specifically made for development within the flood zone from substantial damage. So the first step to determine once these questions have been answered yes and yes, is we need to go out into the field and make an elevation determination. Is the existing finished floor of the structure 1 foot above the base flood elevation? In the case that it is, we can provide an elevation certificate, and we can send that to both yourself as a client and to the county. They will use that to show that, hey, this is actually a structure that even though it's located within the limits, the horizontal limits of the flood zone, its elevation is actually well above that. Now, if you already have an elevation certificate made from some point in the past that was made by a professional surveyor, you can use that. You don't have to get a new one made. You can use the previous one you had, as long as it actually shows that your finished floor is above the base flood elevation. At which point you are free, once you provide it to the county, you're free to proceed and move on to your repairs all the way through to completion. Again, the county, like in these previous two cases, may still require that you submit a floodplain permit just so they have a record of this. But basically you're just showing that, hey, we're already in compliance and that you're able to repair. Now, you can go to a higher standard. We'll talk about in the future videos, but today we're talking about minimum standards. So as long as you're 1 foot above, you can most certainly proceed without the requirements of a floodplain development permit. However, in the case that your finished floor is not 1 foot above the base flood elevation, now you're looking at a case where you do have to submit a floodplain permit to the county. And within that floodplain permit, you're going to have to describe what is the plan of attack. How are you actually going to bring your structure up to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation? There are options. You can either have your structure raised. If you have enough space, if you must have enough land, you could potentially move the structure to a different location that's outside of the flood zone or that is at a higher elevation still within the flood zone. And so at that point, you would submit that plan to the county and they would review it. And at that point of review, they have two options. Either they can approve with conditions saying, okay, we approved the general plan, but we need 1 or 2 modifications, or they can deny it. Even if they deny it, you need to look and see what the reasons for the denial are. And if it's just, maybe a section wasn't filled out, maybe something was filled incorrectly. If that can be fixed and resubmitted, then you're back in the process and waiting for their review. If the denial gets to a point where the county makes the determination, hey, this is in the floodway, this is a really dangerous spot, there's really no way that this can be taken care of due to health and safety, or you just say you're not going to raise your building, they can deny your floodplain development permit. In which case you're trying to figure out what are your other options. And we'll discuss those in another video. But really, it's at a point where if you're trying to rebuild an area that is not safe with a plan that's not safe, and the legal path forward is not looking good, then that's the option where we have to think about: do we need to abandon the property? Do we need to try to seek some sort of compensation from the property for a buyout or something like that? Or are there other options available? So there's some of the options we can talk about, but the county's under no obligation that they have to approve all floodplain development permits. In the case that they do review your floodplain development permit and they approve it, and you answer all the questions, they approve it, then you're ready to move ahead to complete all the repairs for the significant damage done to the structure. At that point, once all the significant damages are done to the structure and the structure has been adjusted, moved, and we know that it is in compliance with the basic requirements, basically meaning that the finished floor, the lowest finished floor of the building, that has a few different definitions depending on what type of building type you have, as long as that's 1 foot above the base flood elevation, then you can call us out. We can do an elevation certificate, and that is the actual process that you prove to the county that your structure is now in compliance with the floodplain development requirements of the county. Optional after that is you may be able to seek a LOMA, depending on the situation, depending on the case, and that is a letter of map amendment, and that can actually remove the requirement to have flood insurance for the structure. I will always recommend that you have flood insurance. You can have a house on top of Mount Everest, and you can have flood insurance. It'll be very cheap. But as we saw in this last flood, there were many structures that were well outside of the flood zone that were damaged, and they don't have any way to get the compensation needed for the damage done to the structures because they don't have flood insurance. Nonetheless, always be aware, flood insurance maximum payout as it stands today is only $250,000 for the structure itself and $100,000 for any possessions or any material lost within the structure. So just keep those numbers in mind as you proceed. So this is a general process. Again, we got to figure out, do we have substantial damage? That determination will come through the county. Are you located within the flood zone? If you're located within there horizontally and you have substantial damage, then you can call us, and we can make the elevation determination. If your finished floor is well above the base flood elevation, at least by 1 foot, then we can provide the elevation certificate to the county, and then you're free to move ahead and repair. If not, we're going into floodplain development permit. We have to consider the process of moving the structure either just vertically or moving it to a new location where it'll be outside of the floodplain or vertically outside of the floodplain. That'll have to be reviewed by the county. Once it's approved, then you complete the construction, and at the very end of that process, you have the elevation certificate, which is what is provided to the county to prove that they have done the job to FEMA. It's very important to note that the county is required to ensure that they are doing all of this process, because if they do not, FEMA can actually come in and say they can be put on probation, in which case everyone that is paying flood insurance, their rates are going to go through the roof, because the idea is that we don't want people coming back and rebuilding in an area where they're going to be put at risk, either their lives or their property. And so slowly but surely, as people make significant improvements or there is damage and they have to rebuild, the idea is structures are built to higher standards, so it's less likely for lives to be lost and less likely for property to be damaged due to flooding. If the community doesn't enforce that, then the system is not working. And there are ways to work forward with that to encourage and to enforce that the communities are actually doing this. And this is why the community needs to make sure, the county in this case, needs to make sure that they actually are enforcing these rules. If you want more information, please check out the Kerr County floodplain links. It's down here. Also for the city of Kerrville. I don't have information for the city of Ingram. However, if anyone has that, they can send it my way. I'll include all these links as well in the description below. You can check us out at wellbornengineering.com. Feel free to give us a call if you have any questions. And on our website, you'll see lots of other additional information you can find and go to if you're looking for other support. If you're interested in flood studies, I highly recommend Waterway Engineering. You can find them at waterwayengineering.com. They also have their own YouTube channel, which is also full of great resources and a lot of information about these most recent floods that happened on July 4th. And finally, keep going. Please don't give up. Hill Country Strong, we want to see everyone be able to come back to a spot. We know this is a difficult time, and we want to help everyone through that. So please feel free to reach out, and we can help you and continue on in the good fight. In the next few videos, we'll be talking about what the future looks like in terms of how can we prevent tragedies like this, prevent greater loss of life, prevent greater damage to floods, and some of the reasoning behind this whole complicated mess of laws and regulations and processes it has. So we'll talk about the why behind all of this in a future video. Thank you, and check us out then.